Steven from Curvy Woodworking. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this brick pattern cutting board.
So for this end grain brick pattern cutting board, we decided to go with the maple and mahogany end grain finish. So we're going to get our maple and mahogany pieces and cut them to be the same thickness and the same width. In between these pieces, we're going to be using a piece of teak wood that we had left over in the shop, and that's going to look like the mortar in between the bricks. Once we glue all the pieces together and it dries up, we're going to take it back over to the table saw. So here you determine how thick you want your cutting board to be. We decided to go with 1.5 inches. So each cut that we're doing is going to be 1 5/8 inches, just because we'll have to shave down any inconsistencies later on, make sure that we have a perfectly flat surface. Once we're done with our cuts, we're going to take it over to the sander just so we don't have any wobbling happening. Sometimes when you do a table saw, if you have any flex in the guard, it's going to have a little bow in there. So before we put it through the planer, we want to make sure that we have enough of a flat surface. Now we can flatten up the surface to be square with one another on the planer. Do a dry run whenever you do a glue up, just to make sure that you like what the pattern looks like. You like how the grains interact with one another. You're going to notice you have some cupping in one direction and another, so if you want to keep a consistent pattern through, this is a good time to do it. We're going to use a generous amount of glue on each piece, and we're going to dry fit them together before we put the clamps on them. Earlier on I mentioned that we use teak as the mortar in between, so I cut additional lengths of that teak to be used on this step. So the initial pieces were used on the initial glue up, and now I have the leftover teak pieces to separate these segmented pieces. When you put the clamps on them, you're going to want to put some clamps on the top and some clamps on the bottom. Now it does resist it, however there is going to be some flexing towards the pipe side, so you're going to have it compressing harder on the top than the bottom, and that's the reason that we flip it over halfway through. You're going to notice I also take a couple passes through with the mallet while I'm tightening up, just because while you're doing the tightening, sometimes these pieces like to slip and they like to maneuver around one another. So beat it down with the hammer a couple times just to make sure that everything sets flat. Once the cutting board is taken out of the forms and you removed all the glue, you're going to start to do the flattening. So we're going to start off with a 40 grit sandpaper on our belt sander, and we're going to take a couple passes through. Make sure you're constantly moving your sander in other directions. You don't just want to go in a linear direction back and forth, or you're going to find that you're going to have some ripples in your wood. So you see I take a couple passes through side to side, a couple forward and backwards, and I'm going to do the same technique I do when I'm working on the stroke sander afterwards. In hindsight, I could have taken the extra step and actually put a half cut off piece and flip the pieces around with one another. Now I have a lot of throwaway pieces, but that's just going to be a lesson I learned for next time. This jig I'm putting together right now is to install the handles on the side of the cutting board. So there's a very narrow surface, but I have to get a perfectly straight cut with my plunge router. So for this, I'm going to just put a back guide along with two sides that are lined up with the cutting board, so it'll stop within the middle of the board and it'll be even on both sides for both handles. After the handles are installed and I take a quick pass through just by hand sanding those awkward curvature points, I'm going to start to put on the cutting board oil finish. You can get this mineral based oil anywhere, Home Depot, Home Hardware, whatever you have nearby. And essentially it'll ask you to leave on this finish for around 20 minutes before you have to wipe off the excess. So the first pass through is just going to be to flood all of the sections and put as much as I can before I have to wipe it off later.
Thanks for watching our video on how we put together our end grain brick pattern cutting board. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to subscribe and hit that alert button. If you want to see some other video content that we put together previously, be sure to watch our jukebox video and how we put that together.